Good evening, and welcome to Narnia by the Fire, as we read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis, with permission from HarperCollins Children's Books. Our reading will last the next half hour. Now, let's step into the wardrobe.
Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our last evening together as we read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis. Now, last time we were together, we saw how the witch finished Aslan off. A terrible, terrible scene. But I wonder if there's hope in this story. I wonder if Aslan had a plan after all. I wonder what's going to happen. Now, this evening, we're going to read the last 3 chapters. So a little bit longer than normal, but we want to finish this book. So let's see what's happening now. Chapter 15, we're going to start there. Deeper Magic from Before the Dawn of Time. Here we go. While the 2 girls still crouched in the bushes, with their hands over their faces, they heard a voice of the witch calling out, "Now, follow me, all, and we will set about what remains of this war. It will not take us long to crush the human vermin and the traitors now that the great fool, the great cat, lies dead." At this moment, the children were for a few seconds in very great danger. For with wild cries, and the noise of shirkling pipes, and the shrill horns blowing, the whole of that vile rabble came sweeping off the hilltop and down the slope past their hiding place. They felt the spectres go by them like a cold wind, and they felt the ground shake beneath them with the galloping feet of the minotaurs, and overhead there went the flurry of the foul wings and the blackness of the vultures and giant bats. At any other time they would have trembled with fear, but now the sadness and shame and the horror of Aslan's death had so filled their minds that they hardly thought of it. As soon as the wood was silent again, Susan and Lucy crept out to the open hilltop. The moon was getting low, and the thin clouds were passing across. But they could still hear and still see, and they could see the shape of the lion's dead body lying there. And down they both knelt in the wet grass and kissed his cold face and stroked his beautiful fur, or what was left of it. And they cried till they could cry no more. And then they looked at each other and held each other's hands for mere loneliness and cried again, and then again were silent. And at last Lucy said, "I can't bear to look at his horrible muzzle. I wonder, could we take it off?" So they tried, and after a lot of working at it, for their fingers were cold and it was the darkest part of the night, they succeeded. And when they saw his face without it, they burst out crying again, and kissed it, and fondled it, and wiped away the blood and the foam as well as they could. And it was all the more lonely and hopeless and horrid that I know how to describe. "I wonder, could we untie him as well?" said Susan presently. But the enemies, out of pure spitefulness, had drawn the cord so tight that the girls couldn't undo the knots. Now, I hope anybody who reads this book has been quite as miserable as Susan and Lucy were that night. But if you had been, and if you've been up all night and cried till you have no more tears left in you, you will know that there comes in the end a sort of quietness. You feel as if nothing was ever going to happen, and at any rate, that is how it felt for these 2. Hours and hours seemed to go by in this dead calm, and they hardly noticed that they were getting colder and colder. But at last, Lucy noticed 2 other things. One was that the sky on the east of the hill was turning a little less dark than it had been a few hours ago, and the other was some tiny movement on the grass at her feet. At first she took no interest in it. What did it matter? Nothing mattered now. But at last she saw that whatever it was, it began to move up the upright stones of the stone table, and now whatever they were moving about on Aslan's body. She peered closer. They were little grey things. "Ah!" said Susan from the other side of the table. "How beastly! They're horrid little mice crawling all over him. Go away, you little beasts!" And she raised her hand to frighten them away. "Wait," said Lucy, who had been looking at them more closely. "Can you see what they're doing?" Both girls bent down and stared. "I do believe," said Susan. "How queer, they're nibbling away at the cords." "That's what I thought," said Lucy. "I think they're friendly mice. Poor little things, they don't realise he's dead. They think it'll do some good if they untie him." It was quite definitely lighter now. Each of the girls noticed for the first time the white face of the other. They could see the mice nibbling away, dozens and dozens, even hundreds, of the little field mice. And at last, one by one, the ropes were all gnawed through. The sky in the east was whitish by now, and the stars were getting fainter, all except one very big one low down on the eastern horizon. They felt colder than they had been all night, and the mice crept away again. The girls cleared away the remains of the gnawed ropes. Aslan looked more like himself without them, and every moment his dead face looked nobler. As the light grew, they could see it better. In the wood behind them, a bird gave a chuckling sound. It had been so still for hours and hours that it startled them. Then another bird answered it, and soon there were birds singing all over the place. It was quite definitely early morning now, and not late night. "I'm so cold," said Lucy. So am I," said Susan. "Let's walk about a bit." So they walked to the eastern edge of the hill and looked down. The one big star had almost disappeared. The country all looked dark and grey. But beyond, at the very end of the world, the sea showed pale. The sky began to turn red, and they walked to and fro more times than they can count between the dead Aslan and the eastern ridge, trying to keep warm. And oh, how tired their legs felt. But then at last, as they stood for a moment, looking towards the sea and Cair Paravel, which they could now just make out, the red turned to gold, a gold along the line where the sea and the sky meet, and very slowly up came the edge of the sun. At that moment they heard from behind them a loud noise, a cracking, a deafening noise as if a giant had broken a giant's plate. "What's that?" said Lucy, clutching Susan's arm. I feel afraid to turn around," said Susan. "Something awful must be happening." "Oh, they're doing something worse to him," said Susan. "Come on." And she turned, pulling Susan around with her. The rising of the sun made everything so different. All colours and shadows were changed. That for a moment they didn't see the important thing. But then they did. The stone table was broken into 2 pieces by a great crack that ran down it from end to end, and there was no Aslan. Oh, cried the girls, rushing back to the table. "Oh, it's too bad," sobbed Lucy. "They might have left his body alone." "Who's done it?" cried Susan. "What does this mean? Is it more magic?" "Yes," said a great voice behind their backs. "It's more magic." They looked around, and there in the sunrise, larger than they had seen him before, shaking his mane, for it had apparently grown again, stood Aslan himself. "Oh, Aslan!" cried the children, staring up at him, almost as much frightened as they were glad. "Aren't you dead then, Aslan?" said Lucy. "Not now," said Aslan. You're not a..." asked Susan in a shaky voice. She couldn't bring herself to say the word ghost. Aslan stooped his golden head and licked her forehead. The warmth of his breath and the rich sort of smell that seemed to hang about his hair came all over her. "Do I look it?" he said. "Oh, you're real! You're real! Oh, Aslan!" cried Lucy, and both of the girls flung themselves upon him and covered him with kisses. "But what does this all mean?" asked Susan, when they were somewhat calmer. "It means," said Aslan, "that though the witch knew the deep magic, that there is magic deeper still which she did not know. Her knowledge goes back only to the dawn of time. But if she could have looked further back into the stillness and the darkness before time dawned, she would have read there is a different incantation. She would have known that when a willing victim who had committed no treachery was killed in a traitor's stead, the table would crack and death itself would start working backwards. And now?" "Oh, yes, now?" said Lucy, jumping and clapping her hands. "Oh, children," said the lion, "I feel my strength coming back to me. Oh, children, catch me if you can." He stood for a second, his eyes were bright, his limbs quivering, lashing himself with his tail. Then he made a leap high over their heads and landed the other side of the table. Laughing, though she didn't know why, Lucy scrambled over to reach him, and Aslan leaped again. A mad chase began. Round and round the hilltop he led them, now hopelessly out of their reach, now letting go, letting them almost catch his tail, now driving between them, now tossing them in the air with his huge and beautifully velveted paws, and catching them again, and now stopping unexpectedly, so that all three of them rolled over together in a happily laughing heap of fur and arms and legs. It was such a romp as no one has ever seen except in Narnia, and whether it was more like playing with a thunderstorm or playing with a kitten, Lucy could never quite make up her mind. And the funny thing was that when all three finally lay together, panting in the sun, the girls no longer felt in the least tired or hungry or thirsty. "And now," said Aslan, "to business. I feel I am going to roar. You had better put your fingers in your ears." And they did. Aslan stood up, and when he opened his mouth, his face became so terrible that they did not dare to look at it. And they saw all of the trees in front of him bend before the blast of his roar, as the grass bends in a meadow before the wind. And then he said, "We have a long journey to go. You must ride on me." And he crouched down, and the children climbed onto his warm golden back. And Susan sat first, holding tightly to his mane, and Lucy sat behind, holding tightly to Susan. And with a great heave, he rose underneath them and shot off, faster than any horse could go, downhill and into the thick of the forest. That ride was perhaps the most wonderful thing that had happened to them in Narnia. Have you ever had to gallop a horse? Think of that. And then take away the heavy noise of the hoofs and the jingle of the bits, and imagine instead the almost noiseless padding of the great paws. Then imagine, instead of the black and grey or chestnut back of the horse, the soft roughness of golden fur and the mane flying back in the wind. And then you are going about as twice as fast as any fastest racehorse. But this is a mount that doesn't need to be guided and never grows tired. He rushes on and on, never missing his footing, never hesitating, threading his way with perfect skill between the tree trunks, jumping over bush and briar and the smaller streams, wading the larger, swimming the largest of all. You are riding, not a road, nor in a park, nor even on the downs, but across Narnia, in spring, down solemn avenues of beech and arrow, across sunny glades of oak, through wild orchards of snow-white cherry trees, past roaring waterfalls and mossy rocks and echoing caverns, up windy slopes alight with gorse bushes, and across the shoulders of a heathery mountain, and along giddy ridges, and down again into the wild valleys, and out into the blue acres of flowers. It was nearly midday when they found themselves looking down at the steep hillside at the castle. A little toy castle it looked from where they stood, which seemed to be all pointed towers. But the lion was rushing down at such a speed that it grew larger every moment, and before they had time to even ask themselves what it was, they were already on level with it. And now it took no longer. It didn't any longer look like a toy castle, but rose frowning in front of them. No face looked over the battlements, and the gates were fast shut. And Aslan, not at all slacking his pace, rushed straight as a bullet towards it. "The witch is home!" he cried. "Now, children, hold tight." The next moment the whole world seemed to turn upside down, and the children felt as if they had left their insides behind them. For the lion had gathered himself together for a greater leap than any had yet made, and jumped, or you may call it flying rather than jumping, right over the castle wall. The two girls, breathless but unhurt, found themselves tumbling off his back in the middle of a wide stone courtyard full of statues. Chapter 16. What happened about the statues? "What an extraordinary place," cried Lucy. "All those stone animals, and people too. It's like a museum." "Shh," said Susan. "Aslan's doing something." And he was indeed. He had bounded up to the stone lion and breathed on him. Then, without waiting a moment, he whisked round, almost as if he had been a cat chasing its tail, and breathed also on a stone dwarf, which, as you remember, was standing a few feet from the lion with his back to it. Then he pounced on the tall stone dryad, which stood beyond the dwarf, turned rapidly aside to deal with the stone rabbit on his right, and rushed to the two centaurs. But at that moment Lucy said, "Oh, Susan, look at the lion." I expect you've seen someone put a lighted match to a bit of newspaper, which is propped up in the grate against an unlit fire. And for a second nothing seems to happen. And then you notice a tiny streak of flame creeping along the edges of the newspaper. And it was like that now. For a second after Aslan breathed upon him, the stone lion looked just the same. Then a tiny streak of gold began to run along his white marbled back, and then it spread. Then the colour seemed to lick all over him, as the flames lick over a bit of paper. Then, while his hind quarters were still obviously stone, the lion shook his mane, and all the heavy stone folds rippled into living hair. Then he opened his great red mouth, warm and living, and gave a prodigious yawn. And now his hind legs had come to life. He lifted one of them and scratched himself. Then, having caught sight of Aslan, he went bounding after him and frisking around him, whimpering with delight and jumping up to lick his face. Of course, the children's eyes turned to follow the lion. But the sight they saw was so wonderful that they soon forgot about him. Everywhere the statues were coming to life. The courtyard looked no longer like a museum, it looked more like a zoo. Creatures were running after Aslan and dancing around him until he was almost hidden in the crowd. Instead of all the deadly white, the courtyard was now a blaze of colours. Glossy chestnut sides of centaurs, indigo horns of unicorns, dazzling plumage of birds, reddy brown of foxes, dogs and satyrs, yellow stockings and crimson hoods of the dwarfs, and the birch girls in silver, and the beech girls in fresh, transparent green, and the larch girls in green so bright that it was almost yellow. And instead of the deadly silence, the whole place rang with the happy sounds of roarings, brayings, yelpings, barkings, squealings, cooings, neighings, stampings, shouts, hurrah, and songs and laughter. "Oh," said Susan in a different tone, "look, I wonder, is it safe?" Lucy looked and saw that Aslan had just breathed on the feet of the stone giant. "It's all right," shouted Aslan joyously. "Once the feet are put right, the rest of him will follow." "That's exactly what I meant," whispered Susan to Lucy. But it was too late to do anything about it, even if Aslan would have listened to her. The change was already creeping up the giant's legs, and now he was moving his feet. A moment later he lifted the club off his shoulder, rubbed his eyes and said, "Bless me, I must have been asleep. Now, where's that dratted little witch that was running about the ground? Somewhere, just by my feet it was." But when everyone had shouted up to him to explain what had really happened, and when the giant had put his hand to his ear and got them to repeat it all again, so that it was then understood, then he bowed down till his head was no further off the top of the haystack, and touched his cap repeatedly to Aslan, beaming over with his honest ugly face. Now giants of any sort are now so rare in England, that so few giants are good-tempered, that 10 to 1 you have never seen a giant with his face beaming. It's a sight well worth looking at. "Now, for the inside of the house," said Aslan. "Look alive, everyone. Upstairs and downstairs, in my lady's chamber, leave no corner unsearched. You never know where some poor prisoner might be concealed." And into the interior they all rushed for several minutes. In the whole of the dark, horrible, fusty old castle echoed with the opening of windows, and with everyone's voices crying out at once, "Don't forget the dungeons! Give us a hand with this door! Oh, here's another little winding stair! Oh, I say, here's a poor kangaroo! Can you help, Aslan? Phew! God, how it smells in here! Look out for trapdoors! Up here! There's a whole lot more on the landing!" But best of all was when Lucy came rushing upstairs shouting, "Aslan! Aslan! I've found Mr. Tumnus! Oh, do come quick!" A moment later, Lucy and the little fawn were holding each other both by the hands and dancing round and round for joy. The little chap was none the worse for having been a statue, and was, of course, very interested in all she had to tell him. But at last, the ransacking of the witch's fortress was ended. The whole castle stood empty, with every door and window open, and the light of the sweet spring air flooding into all the dark and evil places that needed them so badly. The whole crowd of liberated statues surged back into the courtyard, and it was then, that someone, Tumnus, I think, first said, "But how are we going to get out?" For Aslan had got in by a jump, and the gates were still locked. "That'll be all right," said Aslan. And then rising on his hind legs, he bawled up at the giant. "Hey, you up there," he roared. "What's your name?" "Giant Rumblebuffin, if it please your honour," said the giant, once more touching his cap. "Well then, Giant Rumblebuffin," said Aslan, "just let us out of here, of this, will you?" "Certainly, your honour. It will be a pleasure," said Giant Rumblebuffin. "Stand well away from the gates, all of you little uns." Then he strode to the gate himself, and bang, bang, bang went his huge club. The gates creaked at the first blow, cracked at the second, and shivered at the third. Then he tackled the towers on each side of them, and after a few minutes of crashing and thudding, both of the towers and a good bit of the wall on each side went thundering down in a mass of hopeless rubble. And when the dust cleared, it was odd, standing in that dry, grim, stony yard, to see through the gap and all the grass and the waving trees and the sparkling stream of the forest and the blue hills beyond that, and beyond them, the sky. Blowed, if I ain't all the muck and sweat, said the giant, puffing like the largest railway engine. Come out of being out of that condition, I suppose neither of you young ladies has such a thing as a pocket handkerchief about you, do you? Oh, yes, I've got a handkerchief, said Lucy, standing on her tiptoes and holding her handkerchief up as far as she could reach. Oh, thank you, missy, said Giant Rumblebuffin, stooping down. The next moment Lucy got rather a fright, for she found herself caught up in mid-air between the giant's finger and thumb. But just as she was getting near his face, he suddenly started, and then put her gently back on the ground, muttering, "Bless me, I've picked up the little girl instead. I beg your pardon, missy. I thought you was the handkerchief." No, said Lucy, laughing. "Here it is." This time he managed to get it, but it was only about the same size to him as a saccharin tablet would be to you, so that when you saw him solemnly rubbing it to and fro across his great red face, she said, "I'm afraid it's not much use to you, Mr. Rumblebuffin." No, not at all," the giant said politely. "I never met a nicer handkerchief. So fine, so handy, so I don't know how to describe it." "Oh, what a nice giant he is," said Lucy to Mr. Tumnus. "Oh, yes," replied the fawn. "All the Buffins always were. One of the most respected of all of the giant families in Narnia. Not very clever, perhaps. Well, I never knew a giant that was. But an old family, with traditions, you know. If he'd been the other sort, she'd never have turned him into stone." At this point, Aslan clapped his paws together and called for silence. "Our day's work is not yet over," he said, "and if the witch is to be finally defeated before bedtime, we must find a battle at once." "And join in? Oh, I hope so, sir," said one of the largest centaurs. "Of course," said Aslan. "And now, those who can't eat, keep up. That is, children, dwarfs, and small animals must ride on the backs of those who can. This is lions, centaurs, unicorns, horses, giants, and eagles. Those who are good with their noses must come in front with us lions to smell out where the battle is. Look lively and sort yourselves." And with a great deal of bustle and cheering they did. The most pleased of the lot was the other lion, who kept running about everywhere, pretending to be very busy, but really in order to say to everyone he met, "Did you hear what he said? Us lions. That means him and me. Us lions. That's what I like about Aslan. No side, no standoffishness. Us lions. That meant him and me." At least he went on saying this until Aslan had loaded him up with 3 dwarves, 1 dryad, 2 rabbits, and a hedgehog. That steadied him a bit. When all were ready, and it was the big sheepdog who actually helped Aslan the most in getting them into a sort of proper order, they set out through the gap in the castle wall. At first, the lions and the dogs went nosing about in all directions. But then suddenly, one great hound picked up a scent and gave a bay. There was no time lost after that. Soon all the dogs and lions and wolves and other hunting animals were going at full speed with their noses to the ground, and all the others streaked out for about half a mile behind him, and they were following as fast as they could. The noise was like an English fox hunt, only better, because every now and then, with the music of the hounds, was a mixed roar of the other lion, and sometimes the far deeper and more awful roar of Aslan himself. Faster and faster they went, as the scent became easier and easier to follow, and then, Just as they came to the last curve in a narrow winding valley, Lucy heard, above all these noises, another noise, a different one. It was a noise of shouts and shrieks, and a clashing of metal against metal. Then they came out of the narrow valley, and at once she saw the reason. There Peter stood, and Edmund, and all the rest of Aslan's army, fighting desperately against the crowd of horrible creatures who seemed to have seen who they had seen last night. Only now in the daylight they looked even stranger and more evil and more deformed. There also seemed to be far more of them. Peter's army, which had their backs to her, looked terribly few, and there were statues dotted all over the battlefield, so apparently the witch had been using her wand. But she didn't seem to be using it now. She was fighting with her stone knife. It was Peter that she was fighting, both of them going at it so hard that Lucy could hardly make out what was happening. She only saw the stone knife and Peter's sword flashing so quickly that it looked like 3 knives and 3 swords. The pair were in the centre, and on each side the line stretched out. Horrible things were happening wherever she looked. "Off my back, children," shouted Aslan, and they both tumbled off. Then, with a roar that shook all Narnia from the western lamppost to the shores of the eastern sea, the great beast flung himself upon the White Witch. Lucy saw her face lifted towards him for 1 second with an expression of sheer terror and amazement. Then lion and witch had rolled over together, but with the witch underneath. And at the same moment, all warlike creatures whom Aslan had led from the witch's house rushed madly on the enemy lines. Dwarves with their battle axes, dogs with teeth, and the giant with his club and his feet also crushed dozens of the foe. Unicorns with their horns, centaurs with their swords and hooves. And Peter's tired army cheered, and the newcomers roared, and the enemy squealed and gibbered till the wood re-echoed with the din of that onset. Now we come to chapter 17. The hunting of the white stag. The battle was all over in a few minutes after their arrival. Most of the enemy had been killed in the first charge of Aslan and his companions, and when those who were still living saw that the witch was dead, they either gave themselves up or took flight. The next thing that Lucy knew was that Peter and Aslan were shaking hands. It was strange to see Peter looking as he looked now. His face was so pale and stern, and he seemed so much older. "It was all Edmund's doing, Aslan," Peter was saying. "We'd have been beaten if it hadn't been for him. The witch was turning our troops into stone right and left, but nothing would stop him. Nothing would. He fought his way through 3 ogres to where she was, she was turning one of your leopards into a statue. And when he reached her, he had the sense to bring his sword smashing down on her wand instead of trying to go for her directly, and simply getting made into a statue himself for his pains. That was the mistake all the rest were making. Once her wand was broken, we began to have a chance. If we hadn't lost so many already. He was terribly wounded. We must go and see him." They found Edmund in the charge of Mrs. Beaver, a little way back from the fighting line. He was covered in blood. His mouth was open. His face was a nasty green colour. "Quick, Lucy," said Aslan. And then almost for the first time Lucy remembered the precious cordial that had been given to her for a Christmas present. Her hands trembled so much that she could hardly undo the stopper, but she managed it in the end and poured a few drops into her brother's mouth. "There are other people wounded," said Aslan, while he was still looking eagerly into Edmund's pale face and wondering if the cordial would have any result. Yes, I know, said Lucy crossly. Wait a minute. Daughter of Eve, said Aslan in a graver voice. Others also are at the point of death. Must more people die for Edmund? I'm sorry, Aslan, said Lucy, getting up and going with him. And for the next half an hour they were busy, she attending the wounded while he restored those who had been turned to stone. When at last she was free to come back to Edmund, she found him standing on his feet, not only healed of his wounds, but looking better than she had ever seen him look. Oh, for ages. In fact, ever since the first term of that horrid school, which was where he had begun to go so wrong. He had become his real old self again, and could look you in the face. And there on the field of battle, Aslan made him a knight. Does he know, whispered Lucy and Susan, what Aslan did for him? Does he know what the arrangement with the witch really was? Hush! No, of course not, said Lucy. Oughtn't he be told? Said Lucy. Well, surely not, said Susan. It would be too awful for him. Think how you would feel if you were he. All the same, I think he ought to know, said Lucy. But at that moment they were interrupted. That night they slept where they were. How Aslan provided food for them, and for all of them, I don't know. But somehow or other they found themselves all sitting down on the grass to a fine high tea at about 8 o'clock. Next day they began marching eastward down the side of the great river, and the next day after that, at about tea time, they actually reached the mouth. The castle of Cair Paravel, on its little hill, towered above them. Before them were the sands, with rocks and little pools of salt water, and seaweed, and the smell of the sea, and the long miles of bluish-green waves breaking for ever and ever on the beach. And oh, the cry of the seagulls. Have you heard it? Can you remember? At evening after tea, the 4 children all managed to get down to the beach again and get their shoes and stockings off and feel the sand between their toes. But next day was more solemn, for then, in the great hall of Cair Paravel, that wonderful hall with the ivory roof and the west wall hung with peacock's feathers and the eastern door which looks towards the sea, in the presence of all of their friends to the sounds of trumpets, Aslan solemnly crowned them and led them to the 4 thrones amid deafening shouts. Long live King Peter! Long live Queen Susan! Long live King Edmund! Long live Queen Lucy! Once a king in Narnia, always a king or queen. Bear it well, sons of Adam, bear it well, daughters of Eve, said Aslan. And through the eastern door, which was wide and open, came the voices of the mermen and the mermaids, swimming close to the shore and singing honour to the new kings and queens. So the children sat on their thrones, and sceptres were put into their hands, and then they gave rewards and honours to all of their friends, to Tumnus the fawn, and to the beavers, and to giant Rumblebuffin, to the leopards, to the good centaurs, and the good dwarfs, and to the lion. And that night there was a great feast in Cair Paravel, and revelry, and dancing, and gold flashed, and wine flowed, and answering to the music inside, but stranger, sweeter, and more piercing, came the music of the sea people. But amid all these rejoicings, Aslan found himself quietly slipping away. And when the kings and queen noticed that he wasn't there, they said nothing about it. For Mr. Beaver had warned them, he'll be coming and he'll be going, he had said. One day you'll see him, and another you won't. He doesn't like being tied down, and of course, he has other countries to attend to. But it's quite all right. He'll often drop in. Only you mustn't press him. He's wild, you know. He's not like a tame lion. Now, as you see, the story is nearly, but not quite, at an end. These 2 kings and 2 queens governed Narnia well. and long and happy was their reign. At first, much of their time was spent seeking out the remnants of the White Witch's army and destroying them. And indeed, for a long time there would be news of evil things lurking in the wild parts of the forest. And hunting here and a killing there, a glimpse of a werewolf 1 month and a rumour of a hag the next. But in the end, all that foul brood was stamped out. And they made good laws and kept peace, and saved good trees from being unnecessarily cut down, and liberated young dwarfs and young satyrs from being sent to school, and generally stopped busybodies and interferers and encouraged ordinary people who wanted to live and let live. And they drove back the fierce giants, quite different from Giant Rumblebuffin, on the north of Narnia when these ventured across the frontier. And they entered into a friendship and alliance with countries beyond the sea, and paid them visits of state and received visits of state from them. And they themselves grew and changed as the years passed. Peter became tall and a deep-chested man and a great warrior, and he was called King Peter the Magnificent. And Susan grew into a tall and gracious woman with black hair that fell almost to her feet, and the kings of the countries beyond the sea began to send ambassadors asking for her hand in marriage. But she was called Susan the Gentle. Edmund was a graver and quieter man than Peter, and great in counsel and judgment. He was called King Edmund the Just. But as for Lucy, she was always gay and golden-haired, and all princes in those parts desired her to be their queen, and her own people called her Queen Lucy the Valiant. So they lived in great joy, and if ever they remembered their life in this world, it was only as one remembers a dream. And one year it fell out that Tumnus, who was a middle-aged faun by now and beginning to be stout, came down river and brought them news that the white stag had once more appeared in these parts. The white stag who would give you wishes if you caught him. So these 2 kings and 2 queens, with the principal members of their court, rode a-hunting, with horns and hounds, in the western woods to follow the white stag. And they had not hunted long before they had sight of him, and he led them at great pace, over rough and smooth, and through thick and thin, till the horses of all the courtiers were tired out, and only these 4 were still following. And they saw the stag enter into a thicket, where their horses could not follow. And then said King Peter, for they talked in quite a different style now, for having been kings and queens for so long, "Fair consorts, let us now alight from our horses, and follow the beast into the thicket, for in all my days I have never hunted a nobler quarry." "Sir," said the others, "even so let us do." So they alighted and tied their horses to trees, and went on into the thick of the wood on foot. As soon as they entered, Queen Susan said, "Fair friends, here is a great marvel, for I seem to see a tree of iron." "Madam," said King Edmund, "if you look well upon it, you shall see that it is a pillar of iron with a lantern on top thereof." "By the lion's mane, a strange device," said King Peter, "to set a lantern here where the trees cluster so thick about it, and so high above it that if it were lit, it should give light to no man." "Sir," said Queen Lucy, "by likelihood, this post and this lamp were set here when the trees were smaller in this place, or fewer, or none. For this is a young wood, and the post is old." And they stood looking at it. Then said King Edmund, "I know not how it is, but this lamp on the post worketh upon me strangely. It runs in my mind that I have seen the like before, as it were in a dream, or in a dream of a dream." "Sir," answered all of them, "it is even so with us as well. And more," said Lucy, For it will not go out of my mind that if we pass this post and lantern, either we shall find strange adventures, or else some great change of our fortunes. Madam, said King Edmund, the like foreboding stirreth my heart also. And mine, fair brother, said King Peter. And mine too, said Susan. Wherefore by my counsel we shall lightly return to our horses and follow the white stag no further. Madam, said King Peter, therein I pray thee have me excused, for never since we four were kings and queens in Narnia have we set our hands to any high matter, as battles, quests, feats of arms, acts of justice and the like, and then given over, but always what we have taken in hand, the same we have achieved. Sister, said Queen Lucy, my royal brother speaks rightly, and it seems to me that we should be shamed if for any fearing or foreboding we turned back from following so a noble beast as now we have in chase. And so say I, said King Edmund, and I have such desire to find the signification of such this thing that I would not, by my good, will turn back for the richest jewel in all of Narnia and all the islands. Then, in the name of Aslan, said Queen Susan, if you will all have it so, let us go on and take the adventure that shall find to us. So these kings and queens entered the thicket, and before they had gone a score of paces, they all remembered that the thing they had seen was called a lamp-post. And before they had gone 20 more paces, they noticed that they were making their way not through branches, but through coats. And next moment, they all came tumbling out of the wardrobe door into the empty room, and they were no longer kings and queens in their hunting array, but just Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy, in their old clothes. It was the same day, and the same hour of day, on which they had all gone into the wardrobe to hide. Mrs. Macready and the visitors were still talking in the passage, but luckily they never came into the empty room, and so the children weren't caught. And that would have been the very end of the story if it hadn't been that they felt they must explain to the professor why 4 of the coats in his wardrobe were missing. And the professor, who was a very remarkable man, didn't tell them not to be silly or tell any lies, but believed the whole story. No, he said, I don't think it will be any good trying to go back through the wardrobe door to get the coats. You won't get into Narnia again by that route. Nor would the coats be much use now, if you did, eh? I mean, what's that? Yes, of course you'll get back to Narnia again some day. Once a king in Narnia, always a king in Narnia. But don't go trying to use the same route twice. Indeed, don't try to get there at all. It'll happen when you're not looking for it. And don't talk too much about it, even among yourselves. And don't mention it to anyone else, unless you find that they've had adventures in the same place themselves. What's that? How will you know? Oh, you'll know all right. Odd things they say. Even their looks will let the secret out. Keep your eyes open. Bless me. What do they teach you at school these days? And that is the very end of the adventure of the wardrobe. But if the professor was right, it was only the beginning of the adventures of Narnia. That brings us to the end of this amazing story. I hope you enjoyed it, and make sure to go through those questions in the description box. I think there's loads to learn from this story. I'll see you soon. Good night, everyone.
Well, thanks for joining us, and thank you to HarperCollins Children's Books. As you head into your evening, there's some questions to ponder in the description box below.